Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast on competition law in digital markets in Latin America by the Center for Entertainment, Technology and Information Law, CENTI. We are here today to discuss the key issues, relevant topics, and the proposed solutions by experts on competition and innovation policy in Latin America. The purpose of this project is to open the debate in society and policy making regarding how to approach regulation and enforcement in digital markets. To lead this discussion, we have invited some of the most experienced professionals in competition, technology, and innovation to help us lead this debate. Today, I would like to introduce our guest, Mr. Geoffrey Manne. He is the president and the founder of the International Center for Law and Economic, who also is a distinguished fellow at Northwestern University Centers of Law, Business, and Economics. He is a Juris Doctor from the University of Chicago and is an expert on economic analysis of the law, especially in antitrust, consumer protection, telecommunications, and technology regulation. Before founding the ICLE, he headed up the program on law and economics engagement in Microsoft Legal Department. Mr. Manne's publications have appeared in numerous journals, mainly in competition, technology, regulation, and enforcement in these areas. Welcome, Geoffrey.
Thanks. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So today, we're here to discuss merger control. And one of the first questions we want to ask from the public policy perspective is, how does merger control, or how can merger control impact innovation in different jurisdictions?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Let's take one step back and start with sort of the premise underlying merger control. I think it'll help us answer the question about how it affects innovation. Merger control is usually conceived of as a way of deterring or stopping anti-competitive behavior before it even starts, based on the notion that firms that are more likely to act anti-competitively the less competition they face or the greater market power they have. And mergers can lead to a reduction in competition or an increase in market power. I want to say sort of as a general point about mergers, and then in a second I'm going to talk about horizontal and vertical mergers, and then I'll really get to the innovation question. As a general matter, I think merger enforcement is a really significant part of virtually every country's competition enforcement regime. But it's important not to rush to condemn mergers too quickly. They are and can be an important source of efficiency, of innovation, of improved corporate management. And it's important to be mindful of the limitations and risks of merger enforcement, this incipiency regime that tries to stop anti-competitive harms before they start. So almost by definition, merger control is about predicting the future. And we're not always all that great about predicting the future. So we're trying to stop these harms before they materialize. Prediction is difficult, and it means that there's always a risk that stopping a merger will be erroneous and will do more harm than good. That's true of all law enforcement whatsoever. So that's not crazy. It's just that in particular with mergers, we're not looking at past behavior and trying to evaluate its consequences. We're looking at future behavior. And we're looking at a structural change in the market and trying to predict how it will affect future behavior. But at the same time, this is what's different about merger control than most other forms of law enforcement. It's rarely the last or the only way of preventing future harm. If two companies merge and then engage in anti-competitive conduct, it might be possible to address that anti-competitive conduct, that harmful conduct, directly when it happens. It's not always the case, but it's true on average, and it's another reason not to over-enforce against mergers. It's not like if we accidentally allow a merger to go through, we don't have a chance to address potentially anti-competitive conduct in the future. However, if we don't allow a merger to go through, if we stop a merger, there may be no way to subsequently ensure that whatever the benefits that merger might have conferred are capitalized upon in the market in the future. The merger is stopped, the merger is stopped. That's our last chance to get the benefits of the merger. Whereas if a merger is allowed, we often have the ability to enforce against harmful conduct later. Okay, so this is my general sort of spiel about mergers. They're important part of the competition enforcement toolkit. In some ways, there's so much experience with them that they're seen as the primary part of the competition enforcement toolkit, and yet they come with real baggage, and we shouldn't be so cavalier about merger control. Now, one of the big reasons for that is, as I said at the outset, mergers can provide lots of benefits. They aren't inherently harmful. Horizontal mergers do inherently remove some competition from the market. If you have two head-to-head competitors and they merge together, there is a reduction in competition. But there may, of course, be countervailing benefits that arise because of that. We kind of understand the dynamics of horizontal mergers, and we're still involved in predicting the future, but at least we know if you're merging with a head-to-head competitor, you are removing some amount of competition from the market. The big problem, and especially the problem for innovation, arises with vertical mergers, I think. Vertical mergers are not mergers of head-to-head competitors. They're mergers of companies at different levels in a supply chain or a production process, like a manufacturer merging with a distributor, or an input maker of some sort merging with a final product manufacturer. Unlike horizontal mergers, vertical mergers don't automatically remove a direct competitor. They don't automatically reduce competitive constraints. In fact, vertical mergers have an opposite virtually automatic effect, which is they remove what's called double marginalization. Before a merger, both that manufacturer and that distributor needed to earn a separate profit on the products they were getting out to market. After a merger, the combined firm now only has to earn one profit. You have an automatic pressure, downward pricing pressure from a vertical merger, whereas with a horizontal merger, you have a little bit more of an automatic upward pricing pressure effect. So that's, again, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that all horizontal mergers are bad. I'm just saying that before we even assess the benefits of that merger, we know there's some potential risk involved. That's not true with vertical mergers. But what vertical mergers also do as a kind of almost automatic matter is they help to reduce innovation, research and development inefficiencies and externalities. So you frequently have this with vertical relationships, you have sort of complicated interactions between, say, input providers and output providers. This is not always true, but this is generally true. The one sort of builds on the other. And when such companies are separate and they don't know perfectly exactly what the other company is doing, and they don't have the ability to guide the innovation, the research and development process simultaneously of the two entities that have to interact with each other, you have a slowing of innovation. You have a transaction cost that potentially impedes innovation in that context. Enabling the vertical merger means that those innovation streams, those research and development pipelines are now under one management, and they can be managed to sort of support each other rather than to act sequentially. Wait until you hear about what innovations are happening upstream before you incorporate that in your product downstream, or vice versa. So, and this is, by the way, I should say, this is also potentially true of horizontal mergers. That's one of the potential sources of efficiencies with horizontal mergers. But it's very commonly true with vertical mergers. So to bring this sort of to a conceptual argument or points to a close, mergers can and often are all about improving innovation, improving efficiency between companies that are where it's difficult for them to coordinate if they remain separate. That doesn't mean that stopping all mergers, that doesn't mean that enforcing our merger regime inherently impedes innovation, but it means if you get it wrong, if you don't recognize those sources of innovation efficiency that come from allowing the companies to coordinate better, and you do decide to stop that merger where you could have realized those benefits, yes, there is the risk, and I think there are examples where we've seen that a sort of overly aggressive merger enforcement regime can impede innovation.
Okay, thank you. What are the challenges in digital markets regarding market definition and the theory of harm? Can we talk about platforms, ecosystems? So how do we address these issues?
Yeah, so merger issues are, as I said, they're always complicated. They're even more complicated in the platform sort of digital market context. One of the important reasons for that are the problems of market definition in these markets. So let me start there. So with market definition, with a merger, you always have to define the market in which the merging parties compete, because that's how you know that there's a potential for a reduction for competition in that market. This is true of all antitrust enforcement, but especially for mergers, you have to define the market first in order to assess the likely competitive effects of the merger. But what do you do, though, if you have a company like, maybe it's easiest seen with Amazon. Amazon is an online retailer, people say, as if that is its own market, as if there's a separate market for online retail and a separate market for offline, brick and mortar retail when you walk down the street to the grocery store. Problem is that while the business models are different between Amazon and a supermarket, it doesn't mean that they don't compete head to head with each other just because one is offline and one is online. But there is a real tendency when it comes to these platforms to think that they exist in a sort of a cocoon that is insulated from competition in offline markets. And very frequently, that's not the case. So in Amazon's case, we have an actual example of this. We have a complaint that was brought by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission against Amazon. It's not a merger challenge, but it does go through the market definition exercise, and so I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about. And it is presumably exactly how market definition would be attempted by enforcers if they were challenging an Amazon-related merger. So they defined a couple of markets. One of them is the online superstore market. And they're very clear that they think that offline superstores, which really means, Walmart, I guess. I'm not sure what the equivalent would be in Latin America, but I know Walmart exists in Latin America, so let's use Walmart. So the FTC alleges that Walmart isn't in the same market as Amazon. Even though they sell many of the exact same products, they certainly sell competing products, but Amazon is online and Walmart is offline. And people shop differently or behave differently when they're searching for products in one versus the other. I don't think that's the case. I mean, I actually think, I was thinking about this the other day, have I ever purchased anything from Amazon that I haven't also purchased offline at some point at a grocery store or some other store? I can't think of a single example of anything that I've bought at Amazon that I haven't also sometimes bought at an offline store. And I think that's a pretty typical sort of position. I don't think I'm unique in that regard. I think this goes to this problem of thinking that there's a kind of exceptionalism to online conduct, even in certain circumstances where we know full well, just by looking at the way people behave, that that's not true. Another market definition problem with respect to a company like Amazon is, as I said, the first market they defined is online superstores. So it excludes competition from stores that specialize in a certain type of product. A superstore is a store that sells, I don't remember the number, but let's say 100,000 different products rather than only 20,000 different products or something. The problem is, of course, people often don't care what type of store they're buying from. They care about the product itself. The channel of distribution isn't usually as important as the product itself. If you buy sporting goods from Amazon, which you can do, you could also buy sporting goods from an online sporting goods store or an offline sporting goods store. To exclude those from the market seems to not coincide with the way people behave. Now, why is this important? Because the scope of competition matters to determining the likelihood that a merger will lead to an incentive and an ability for the merged company to act anti-competitively. If Amazon has no competitors and Amazon were to buy another company, in fact, right now they're trying to buy a robot vacuum company called iRobot. They make Roomba robot vacuums, right? And Amazon has engaged in a lot of mergers in the past. So if they have no competition, because they're in this market where they are the only company that exists as an online superstore, let's say, then of course the merger is going to be concerning because, well, let's say there is a little bit of competition, but Amazon is buying the totality of competition. That would concern us. If, on the other hand, Amazon competes with every grocery store, every corner market, every other online retailer, a concern around a merger would be much smaller. In fact, I think I can't swear these numbers are exactly right, but they're close if they're not right. Amazon is deemed to have something like 40 or 50% of the online retail market. But if you look at retail overall, including offline retail, their share is something like 12 or 15%. There's much more reason to be concerned about a merger where a company has 50% of the market than when they have 12% of the market. When you have 12% of the market, you shouldn't even bother looking at the merger, right? Market definition in general, for online platforms, as I said, is difficult. These companies engage in lots of different kinds of activities, and they could engage in activities that compete with each other, even if they don't. They do regularly end up competing with each other, however. So you have a case like the Google shopping case in Europe. So Google has this product or this service on its search result page. If you search for a camera or something, in addition to getting the usual Google search results, you'll get some little pictures, a little graphic, and a list of different stores selling cameras at the very top of those results. It lets you compare prices and other attributes of the thing you might want to buy, figure out which camera you want to buy, and then compare where you want to buy it. So the European Commission brought a case against this conduct by Google, saying it was self-preferencing. It was favoring its own search comparison results. And there are other companies out there like Foundum and others that do their own search comparison, and they should have access to this search result page. And again, not a merger issue, but I'll explain why it's a market definition issue. In assessing the likelihood that this was problematic from the European Commission's perspective, the Commission determined that Amazon was not a competitor of Google's in this comparison shopping market. Now that sounds crazy because Amazon is literally a store where people shop for things, right? But the European Commission's argument was, well, at Amazon, you can not only shop for things, you can not only sort of compare prices and do kind of your shopping research, but you can actually buy things. Google doesn't actually sell products. Eventually, if you use Google to research the thing you want to buy, eventually you're going to go to another site to purchase it. And according to the European Commission, that made them so different that they weren't competitors in the same market, leaving, I would say, one of the very largest competitors out of this market, meaning it was a lot easier to show the potential for anti-competitive harm than I think actually comports with reality. And this, again, is a really big problem with these online platforms because they all do meld into each other's markets all the time. And when one of them is successful at something and it turns out to be something consumers are really interested in, the other one often tries to get into that market and take some of that create some competition for the company that's the incumbent there. But it's not always like the core of their product. Google is a search engine. Google does 1,000 other things, but in some people's minds, if it's not doing search, it's operating sort of outside of its core market, and it may not be included when you look at the how it's competing with, say, Apple, whose core market is selling smartphones, right? And in fact, hate to point the finger at Europe again, but when Europe brought its case against Google for the way it entered into contracts around the Android operating system for smartphone manufacturers, it said that Apple was not in the same market as Google. Why? Because Apple has an integrated system. It makes its own operating system and uses it for its own phones. There aren't independent companies out there that make phones for Apple. Apple makes its own phones, uses its own operating system. Now, in my mind, it's crazy to think that Apple and Android don't compete in the smartphone market. They absolutely do, for a lot of people's business. And the idea that they don't impose a competitive constraint on each other is crazy. Arguably, the European Commission is saying, in this case, that that Android phones and Apple phones are not in the same market. And there's this really kind of funny implication of that. They would never agree to this, but in theory, Apple and Google could merge, and the European Commission would have no problem with it because it says that they're not working in the same market. Now, I think that's crazy, right? We all can see that that's crazy. But it creates lots of problems, and I think it leads the enforcers to get the nature of competition in these markets often very wrong, which is unfortunate because I think in many cases, mergers and other conduct undertaken by these firms is clearly geared to the benefit of consumers. It's very rare that consumers complain about a merger or activities these firms are undertaking. It's competitors that complain. And enforcers seem to listen to the competitors and undertake this kind of narrow market definition analysis that favors those competitors, I think, to the harm of consumers.
Thank you. Hearing you, I couldn't avoid thinking about the DMA, because actually the DMA tries to hinder the competition that many of these big tech can actually impose on each other, but not allowing them to combine the services they make. So actually, it can have an anti-competitive effect at the end, and you see how this begins, and these problems of market definition and theory of harm, because then the DMA will like to create these like capsules for each of them.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, and I think, an interesting point that makes me think of that's worth mentioning is, I think one of the big impetuses for a DMA or a DMA-like regimes that we're seeing in other countries is a concern around data, companies that have lots of data. Obviously, in other places, there are Digital Services Act. There are lots of things that are regulating data in many countries. But the DMA is certainly, one of its concerns is that a company that has a lot of data in one of these sort of silos might use that data to compete unfairly in one of these markets that's, sort of outside its core practice. What's really strange about that is it's tantamount to saying this company has data that improves its product, and it could use that data to improve some other product it isn't currently making and really compete with Apple or Amazon or whoever it is. But we think that that's a problem. In other words, competing better is a problem. This is not what antitrust is supposed to do. But the DMA kind of takes this implicit assumption that the use of large amounts of data is harmful, when to a first approximation, what companies are really doing with data is improving their products to the benefit of consumers. There may be other things that we can worry about. That's why there are privacy laws, there are various other things. I'm not saying that there can't be a problem with data, but the underlying idea about, in fact, it comes up in mergers, about risks of combining one company's data with another company's product or two companies' data sets together is this idea that there's some inchoate harm to come from that, when really the dynamic they're often describing is that they can improve their product more because of the amount of data they have. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. So, to the extent the DMA is built on that kind of thinking, or DMA-like regimes are built on that kind of thinking, I think it's a real problem.
I agree with you. And regarding this exceptionalism and other labels created, finally would like to address killer acquisitions. So we have seen a lot of debate about killer acquisitions and the role between startups and these big tech companies as they are addressed. How should we address these killer acquisitions? Do they exist? Is this something that is happening? What is their effect? What does the case law show, or the evidence about the killer acquisitions?
Well, there's remarkably little evidence to suggest that killer acquisitions are a problem anywhere. There's no evidence that I know of to suggest that killer acquisitions are a problem when it comes to digital markets. So the main source of concern around killer acquisitions comes from an academic paper studying the pharmaceutical industry. And this paper, which has had an enormous and outsized influence, like, for example, the Furman report, which was the report that led to the current Digital Markets Like Act in the UK. It was the basis for the decision to implement a large new regulatory regime in the UK. It talks about killer acquisitions, and the only thing it cites to say killer acquisitions are a problem is this one academic paper that looked at pharmaceutical industries. And I should be clear, that act, the DMCC, I think it's now being called in the UK, doesn't relate to pharmaceutical companies at all. It relates to digital markets. So this one paper, it's actually a very good paper. I mean, it's a really well done paper. And I think it does a pretty good job identifying what might be some problematic mergers in the pharmaceutical industry. The maximum, I think it overstates it, but the maximum number it finds is something like 6% of mergers, and there were hundreds of mergers in the pharmaceutical industry it studied. 6% of those mergers might be killer acquisitions. I probably should have started by saying what a killer acquisition is. A killer acquisition is